Seated. Well, last week I had the privilege of preaching at the Unitarian Church in Fort Collins, Colorado. It snowed 6 inches there and the whole city shut down. I said to them, as a person who formerly lived in Vermont, that was about a dusting, according to the Vermonters. So I was glad to see you all arrive here, even in the freezing fog and drizzle. To Coloradans, this is nothing. I assured them that I was going to encourage you not to move to Colorado, and that we had posters up all over the church with pictures of the haze over Denver with signs that said, "They're really high up there." And they thanked me for that propaganda. In fact, I got stuck in the airport on Sunday night while you were having the beginnings of ice. We were sitting watching our phones to see if flights to Dallas would be canceled, and sure enough, just before the flight took off, it was canceled. Standing at the kiosk with 30 other people, a man who was rather keen on getting home that night began yelling at the steward behind the kiosk at the top of his lungs. And the steward listened and then said, "Sir, I'm the only one who can help you." And I thought, I'm preaching on wrath this week. Wrath and the story. That's the task today. When we started this year on compassion, someone said to me, "Can we have compassion for ISIS?" My response at that time is that we might be entering into expert double diamond compassion levels to do that. First, can you have compassion for yourself? Can you have compassion for the people you work with, or the people you live with, or the people who are your friends who drive you crazy, even so? So here comes the story on enemies, with the subtext of wrath. And it's interesting that stories such as the one we told from the Sikh community often come in the form of stories about war. Wrath and war are tied together. One leads to the other and is preserved as tools for the fight. So today, in our Lenten theme, our story converges with wrath and the enemy. It is a parable. The water carrier in our story, who is hauled in front of the king for lack of a better term, for giving water to the enemy on the battlefield, is a parable. The angry general confronts the benevolent guru. The parable asks us to locate those three characters within ourselves. The servant doing what we think is right, the general in charge and doing what the rules say, the guru seeking wisdom in every turn of events. Don't those three characters come into play when we meet the enemy? The battlefield is there too, where our personal wars are waged. The water, the nourishment residing outside the moral distinction of humanity. Some would call that God, some would call that love. The parable. It presupposes that we have battlefields and enemies. I have known people that thought everyone was their enemy, including me. They stomp around in a self-protective glare, with a self-protective glare at all who approach. Curiously, they typically isolate themselves, except they find one ally. They divide the world into nice categories. They live in those fantasies where the police are the enemy, the rich, the clergy, the young, the old, the Arab, the Jew, etc. I lived in a place where this was played out every day, where a fence was put up and everyone on the kibbutz had a machine gun. That was in Israel. And because of the history of real attacks and the arming of the population, the situation became intractable. One action led to a reaction. One fence led to a bomb. One bomb led to a raid. One raid led to a bigger bomb. One bigger bomb led to airstrikes. One airstrikes led to hostages, etc., 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 all in the name of preserving and creating an enemy. If we think personally about this, we might think about how we formulate those ideas about people in our lives. How we create enemies of others. Some are fabrications and some may be real. And then comes the guru, the wisdom. The famous line in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, "Love your enemies and pray for them." A tall order for most of us. I don't think that line means we love them like we love our family members or our friends, but we must find ways to will them some sense of goodness, to see in enemies goodness, and if not goodness, then to try to understand their suffering. My question is, does this work in the extreme? Can African Americans love white supremacists? Can a mother of a child damaged by a stranger or a family member love that stranger or family member? Can we love ISIS, beheading, kidnapping, art-destroying, barbarian, medieval-minded Islamic fundamentalists? I thought as I read the article in The Atlantic this week about ISIS and their attempt to garner an army of 500,000 soldiers to restore some ideal Islamic state by employing slavery, corporal punishment, and the eventual apocalyptic war with what they call Rome, that maybe the concept of love your enemy is dead. Maybe love your enemy, in this case, the fundamentalists who kidnap villages of Christian women, children, and men, probably to put them into some form of chattel slavery, that maybe love your enemy as a concept is dead. Surely this is what the Jews thought in Nazi Germany, the Cambodians under the Khmer Rouge, the intelligentsia under Mao's Cultural Revolution. Love your enemy? Are you for real? And I am sure my distance from the border of Syria and Iraq gives me a chance to even have that thought. If ISIS were marching down Preston Road, coming to enslave my family and destroy our church, I would fight with a wrathful vengeance. And I would do it because it was the only right thing to do, even if I lost my soul, because in my faith, taking another's life would be soul compromising. While I understand how in war these acts are justified, I don't believe that I could take another life. But fortunately, we aren't in that situation. Our enemies mostly appear to be stewards at kiosks at the airport, or wrathful customers. I only know about enemies who are less obvious, which truthfully may be harder to reconcile. And I have been taught over the years that the more clear we see the enemy, those in our lives who want to deny us dignity and freedom, those who want to return to some ideal of the past or commit violence to get their point across, the more clearly we see them, the more we might access compassion for them. That's the rub. To see what is hateful about them may be to see also where the hatefulness comes from. To see what is hurtful about them might be to see the cause of the hurt and the hurt they cause themselves. Maybe to see the enemy more clearly is to know the old saying is true, which may be what this sermon is all about. I have seen the enemy, and the enemy is me. This may be true because to notice what makes us enemies is to know what makes us enemies to ourselves. To know the force within us that wants an enemy is to know how we become distanced from a life of soul and a life of the faith. Now, I saw an article recently about Martha Mullen. She decided it wasn't right to allow the body of Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the young man who led the Boston Marathon bombing, to not be buried. This was a couple years ago. Mullen said she was at Starbucks when she heard a radio news report about the difficulty of Tsarnaev's burial. She said, "My first thought was, Jesus said, love our enemies." And she had an epiphany. Mullen, who was a member of a Methodist church, said she was motivated by her faith. She said, "Nobody is without sin. Certainly this was a horrific act, but he is dead. And what happened is between him and God. We just need to bury his body and move forward." People were making an issue or detracting from the healing that needed to take place. In a sense, Mullen was saying, we are the enemy in that situation. A man who caused wreckage, now dead, is not the enemy anymore. Now, by loving one's enemy, I don't mean taking them in and coddling them and entertaining their wrath or their violence. I don't mean allowing room for them to act out. I'm not saying turn the other cheek if you are struck. I don't believe that. One time in this church I said it's important not to let others hurt you, and someone here said, "How do we do that?" It's taken me a while to respond, but I think it ties to today's story and our examination of wrath. When I say don't let others hurt you, I mean don't let others take away your faith in humanity, your faith in yourself, your faith in something holy that guides you. I mean don't let yourself get destabilized. So with wrath, do you return wrath? The source of every arms race, personal or global. Can you stand firm in the midst of another's hate or another's disdain? I have, here in this church, where we are supposed to be focused on the same goals. I have stood firm in the storms of others' hatefulness and subterfuge, not letting them take my soul was the goal. Now, maybe this isn't love your enemies. Maybe this is self-protective. But I think it's a soulful response to those who want to drown hope. The soulful response is to dig deeper into what motivates and guides the wrathful or the need for an enemy. If it is not love, it might get me to pray for these enemies. If only that they be forgiven, because I can't forgive them. Any prayer for an enemy like that is a way forward. The parable of the Sikh water carrier is a model here. The servant sees the guru in the faces of the enemy. He sees the wise, which is seeing the humanity past the suffering of the enemy. The general is upturned, is upset by the guru's nod to this action. The general wants retribution. The servant didn't bring the enemies into the castle. He fed them water in an unjudgmental way. He fed them the only thing that was free to all, life-giving water. Something tells me, like Tony Campolo's story today, that when we see the vulnerability of the enemy, when we can consider, like those Russians who watched the ragged German foot soldiers stumble from prison to the train platform to go home, that we can say on occasion, these are someone's children, hungry, dying, and far from home. Even standing in the airport, watching the wrathful take out their anger at another. When we do this, we might heal the world a few prayers at a time. And this doesn't remove the very real nature of some enemies. But I believe that in this cosmic battle for the human soul, we must hold out for the better natures of us all. To be a person of faith is to try and see clearly who stands before us, friend or enemy, and know at least that they suffer like we do, that they love like we do, that they struggle like we do. Our sole work is not to ignore another's wrath, not to create more enemies, but to look upon them with a compassionate eye, one that says, this is someone's child, hungry, dying, and far from home. And with that, we might undercut the wrath. We might undercut the need for an enemy and stand strong for the only thing that will save us, which is love. Amen.